Hello and welcome to a special edition of GNAT-TV's In-Depth series. I'm Andrew McKeever, the news director here at GNAT-TV's News Project, and it's a pleasure to have you with us today on Friday, January 18th. Today we're going to explore a topic that's gotten a fair amount of discussion and interest over the past few years, especially since 2015, when a legislative commission that was chaired by Weston's own Wayne Granquist, the Southern Vermont Economic Zone Report, was released that highlighted a lot of issues about the economy of the state, and among them was the changing demographic and workforce composition of the state as a whole, but also Southern Vermont in particular. We were struggling with an aging population and a workforce that was changing and bringing up a lot of concerns about where the workforce of the future is going to come from, not only for private sector businesses, but also for public agencies like volunteer fire departments, for instance, having a hard time recruiting folks of an appropriate age to go into burning buildings. So we thought it was a good moment to bring in I dare say a group of experts, a distinguished panel here, to help us kind of unpack some of this and talk a little bit about where the state might go in terms of repopulating the state or reversing the stagnant population trends. So with us today are Sarah Lang, who is the project manager for the Southern Vermont Economy Project that's based in Brattleboro at the Brattleboro Development Credit Corporation, and the Southern Vermont Economic Project is intended to stabilize, improve, and expand the rural economic and workforce development network in Southern Vermont. So, good to have you with us today, Sarah. Also joining us are Michelle Morocco, who until quite recently was the executive director of the Lightning Jar, a business incubator and co-working space in Bennington. We're also happy to have with us today Natalie Redmond, who is an associate writer in the communications department at Bennington College and has also been active in developing some local events here. And last but hardly least, we have with us Jonathan Cooper, who is the Community and Economic Development Specialist with the Bennington County Regional Commission, and no stranger to GNAT-TV, I might add, with some of his shows. Natalie, I thought we'd start with you. About 9 months or so ago, you wrote a really interesting op-ed piece that was published in the Bennington Banner and elsewhere about how it's not all artisanal cheese and ski resorts. Postgraduate life in Southern Vermont. Or, boy, was that ever a catchy headline? Got my attention immediately. And you talk a little bit in the op-ed about coming here to Vermont from Michigan and finding a job and living here, and some of the issues that go along with that for someone of the millennial generation.
Entering a fire-burning building age.
Right, there you go. We'll have you talk to our fire chief after we leave here.
I've been working on it.
Anyway, I guess just to get us started here, kind of tell us a little bit about what prompted your thought behind writing the article, and kind of how have things gone since that was published back last March?
Well, I've survived 1.5 more winters, for one, so well. I wrote that article about a year after I'd gotten to Vermont. So I'd moved here just sight unseen to the state. I was interning in Rhode Island and had a job opportunity open up at the Dorset Theater Festival. And so I moved. It was about 3 hours closer to home. I'm moving in the right direction now. But as soon as I got here, I'd never been to Vermont before. I didn't know anybody. I didn't have any connections in the area. You type in like apartments.com and Dorset, Vermont, and it kind of laughs at you. It's like, what's that? And that was a really interesting process, though, because to some extent it's hard to move to Vermont until you move to Vermont. The place I have now I found on Manchester Marketplace, which was a small enough and a useful enough resource that I wouldn't have heard of before you got here. So it was just one of those things where when you go into transition like that, you don't really know the local community until you're part of it. And so after about a year of hearing sort of what Manchester's own struggles were and exploring the region and getting a new job in Bennington and sort of seeing that bigger picture of Southern Vermont, it felt time to start saying something about it. And I think that there's a lot, some of what I responded to in that article in particular is talk around Vermont as being a good place for the gig economy, because you can have your artisanal cheese shop, and you can also be a photojournalist and volunteer with the fire department and do a lot of different things, which is very true, but it also requires a certain stability or a certain independent source of wealth or support from family members that not everybody has. And so when you talk about developing a young adult population, you really have to look hard at if you're looking at just getting a younger version of the people that you have in there now, or if you're looking at actually providing enough resources that somebody like me, but perhaps not with, an age young enough to still be on my parents' insurance, or, help from old friends who might have moved to the region or things like that, could potentially go in and find a place to live and find a job that pays for the place to live. And once you start having a support network like that, then you can talk about, opening up your cheese shop or whatever that looks like. But sometimes I think we default too much to marketing language and talking about how, the quality of life here is so great, or, you really can explore or jump in here and look, we can just hike up mountains all day. And that's not true unless there's a certain foundation under that. And I think that was a lot of what I responded to in that piece.
Interesting. Well, why don't we go around the table and have each of you talk a little bit about, what drew you here? How did you all wind up in Vermont when you could have gone almost anywhere else? And Sarah, we'll let you get started on that one.
So my choices were between Vermont and Cleveland, Ohio. Two completely different places. My partner's from Rutland County, born and raised, and we were at UMass Amherst in grad school, and there was sort of the decision. It's like, well, we moved to Vermont, or I guess the other option was break up. So, I chose it. Yeah, I know. So I chose, to look for jobs in Vermont, and Brattleboro is 6 miles over the Vermont border, so still technically in Vermont. So I've been here almost 2 years. It'll be 2 years in March.
Okay.
Yep. So come for the job, stay for the job.
All right. Job rules. All right. And Michelle, what's your story?
Actually. So I first started working in Bennington as an AmeriCorps Vista, and before that I was living just over the border in Massachusetts in North Adams, living with my boyfriend. And at the time I was looking for a job. I was looking all over the country. I had a random interest in Seattle, places like New York, Boston. I really like big cities. And so when I was applying, I'd been offered a job in Rutland and had an interview for a place in Seattle. And part of why I chose Bennington, while the job itself was really interesting, it was this sort of economic development, I didn't know what that meant at that time. I wanted to know. It also is that I lived with my boyfriend who had a job in North Adams, and he could not as easily move. And so is sort of the combined factors of job plus my people are here.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. And Jonathan, I guess that leaves you.
Yeah. So I also went to graduate school with Sarah. We knew each other back in Amherst, and I grew up in Eastern Mass, outside of Boston. But when I began thinking about places, towns, and communities, I felt very strongly that I wanted to live and work in a place of 15 to 20,000, or that sort of mid-sized town to live in. And the scale of Bennington County made a lot of sense to me. And looking at other job positions throughout New England, and I knew I'd wanted to stay in New England, there were opportunities in cities and more in busier areas. And I I sort of liked what Bennington County sort of represented, that there is the traces of the past are still very present. That's around, and people live within that. We're not constantly writing over what was there before, or just holding it in isolation in some historic preservation chamber, but rather it's still lived in. And that made a lot of sense to me, and that was something that I felt very comfortable with. The place is beautiful, and it was a lot of the things that we want to have when we think about sort of that work-life balance lucky enough to have a full-time job to go to and do that, but it was, oh, I can live in the center of town, I can walk to work, I can have that sort of scale, and that's something that I think a lot of people value in their towns throughout the region, throughout southern Vermont, and so that made a lot of sense to us, and so we moved out here September of 2016.
Well, you know, as I've studied and looked at this whole issue of you know, the demographic change that's going on, and I think it's important to say, it's not a problem that's restricted just to Vermont. I mean, I think across the country we're seeing a trend where states that are largely rural, like Vermont and many others, are struggling to, you know, hold on to a population base. A lot of folks seem to be preferring to live in more urban areas where there's more going on and more job opportunities and things like that. Two of the issues that seem to keep popping up that are described as negatives about rural states are the lack of affordable housing and the lack of really strong, robust broadband capabilities. And I guess I wonder, I guess I'll just throw it out to all of you again. Do you think those are two of the main issues, or are they part of a bigger picture?
Yeah, I think it's definitely part of a bigger picture, but, you know, at this time, you know, I think we millennials sort of expect a certain level of, you know, broadband, but also understanding that, you know, if you're going to be coming to a rural state, that that might have to be something you compromise on. I really think that if people choose to move here, it has to be a very educated choice, and it has to be a very intentional choice. You know, I think it's a lot easier to sort of bounce around to bigger cities because you sort of know they have all the amenities that you would, you know, maybe that you're used to. But I think it's an intentional choice to move here, and that's unfortunately something you might have to, you know, grapple with.
Mm-hmm. And what's really interesting is because of that intentionality, and because this is such a big problem that, you know, I don't know enough about issues going on towards addressing it to say one way or the other, but because it is such a big thing that needs to be fixed, it feels like strange timing for something like the $10,000 remote worker incentive to be coming out, which, you know, if you look at it from a PR perspective, that's a wonderful, flashy thing to be able to say, but
It got a lot of attention.
It got a lot of attention, so it serves a purpose there, but at the same time, it's kind of like, okay, well, I'm a go-getter who wants to take advantage of that, and you get there, and then you have more issues than you could have imagined that you're walking into, and whether or not the grant is also only for 2 years, and I don't see, you know, if you had a really struggly 2 years in there, why you would stay longer, or if there's enough, if that going into the state knowing that you're going to, not knowing that you're going to face those problems and having those problems, if that will then turn you off of Vermont in the long run, even if, had you just known more up front, this is maybe not your best state for remote work, but there could be a job that you get that you can walk to, that you really do enjoy. That felt like a strange thing for us to tout at this time.
Yeah.
So.
I mean, it does seem, I'm with you that it does seem to have generated far more publicity than just that 250,000 or whatever set aside could have produced. And I don't know, if, since I work in economic community development, I've gotten sort of calls from people that I sort of know, you know, through like an alumni network or something like that, where people have wanted to know more about this. And it's been very interesting to see that as a sort of coupled with the stay-to-stay weekends, that has in fact brought Vermont as a place to live to people's minds, because I think the state's been very successful with having be a place to visit. And in some ways, you know, there is that if you have visited and perhaps you've stayed at a resort or something, those amenities have been built in, and now it might, you know, there is going to be a little bit of a the water's going to get a little colder as we move away from that to.
It's nice to take a break from your phone for a vacation.
And
it might not be for your job.
Yeah, that's a very good point. I do think, you know, something that I do see those sort of initiatives as having value. Perhaps it'll be something that people feel really, you know, is appropriately or most easily understood in the context of Burlington or like Springfield, where, you know, VTEL has done a lot of connectivity work. But it does give, I think, a lot of our municipalities, a lot of our regions, a chance to think about, well, how would we measure up there? Can we take advantage of this, and can we, you know, use this sort of PR opportunity or that sort of marketing opportunity as a way to say, well, can we make it so that someone would feel that this would be an appropriate place for someone to move to?
Right.
If we can, that's great. If it seems a little off, well, maybe that gives us a few pointers to what we should be focusing on. But it's hard to say for sure.
I mean, the way that a co-working space in a rural area can function is that because there isn't great internet connection in the sort of broader region, if you have that sort of center that people can come to that does have a solid service, you then can take advantage of that. And the remote worker bill in particular, because it's only 2 years, or it's only 2 years for a reason, right? So it's meant to offset the cost of startup, of moving and getting the equipment and materials you need. And I think they maybe assume that whatever company you're working for will then foot the bill for the co-working space after the first 2 years if you're still working there. And so that it's not actually out of your pocket. And in that way, it's a really interesting idea. And I think the state tried to be they're trying to adopt all of these entrepreneurial sort of tactics and like the sort of lean methods and like try things quickly. For better or worse, right? Like sometimes people try to do things in the spirit of entrepreneurship and really they're just not thinking them through fully. And I'm not going to say that that's necessarily what the state has done, but like I've heard, it's like in my position when I was with the Lightning Drive, heard a lot of criticism of that particular bill and the way that it had morphed through, because that one, in order to get the tax incentive, once you've gone through all this paperwork and such, and you have qualifying expenses, you also need to be working for a company that's out of state. So if you wanted to live in Dorset and work for a company in Burlington, you don't get any of those support systems, which, I mean, from my point of view and many of the points of view from folks that I've talked to is like a huge issue. And in just ignoring the people who currently live here in favor of bringing new folks in. It does seem like that is another option maybe that wasn't explored or felt like it wasn't workable for whatever reason. But it does seem, like I think a pretty well-intentioned initiative, and it is the case where it's like, well, we'll see how it plays. But it's certainly, for the time being, if it got people to at least listen, and it's like hopefully we then have something to say, like rural areas that have co-working spaces have an advantage in this respect, where it's like, or you can have a base of operations at least. It isn't just starting completely from scratch, but it's still, I can imagine that there's been some interesting conversation that came out of that.
I also feel, I mean, that's definitely been one of the biggest criticisms. It's like, well, what about people who already live here? And usually my response to that when I hear that is like, but we have to do more than one or the other. We have to do both. And I think there are a lot of resources and services for residents who do live here currently. And so by sort of attacking our population issue, by helping the people who live here, want to continue to live and stay here, by also trying to attract new people, because we need more people. Like we need an increase in our population. And so it's not one or the other, it's a multi-pronged sort of approach. I don't maybe necessarily agree with it. It did get a ton of press, which, like Jonathan said, it's like, oh yeah, maybe I could live in Vermont, regardless if I'm gonna use that bill. And that's sort of been almost like a feeder into the state-to-state program. When people have been contacting the state, it's been like, oh, well, maybe my situation doesn't exactly fit that bill, but like, have you heard about this program? And I think one of the benefits of the state-to-state program, sort of talking about this, like people not knowing maybe what they're getting into, is by having this sort of, dipping your toe in the water and getting to meet people who live and work here, you can sort of have that real conversation and just be like, it's maybe not what, all artisanal cheese, like, let me tell you what it's actually like to live here and then make your decision on that. And I think that's a great benefit to people who are maybe exploring that. It is
a neat opportunity in some ways that Vermont is different enough that it does feel like you really are shifting gears if you move here. Whereas if, people from Portland, Maine, down through DC, where the cities are getting more and more and more expensive, and the stories of trying to find a place to live or trying to buy real estate is simply almost ludicrous. And the thought is that if someone is in Boston and is feeling priced out of that market, maybe they think of something like Framingham or some outside town. It's like, well, I guess that would work for us. But the thought is, well, now you're just farther away, you're in a less fun area. In some ways, nothing against Framingham. In some ways, though,
I don't think our signal goes there.
Yeah. In some ways, it seems, though, that there's the advantage for Vermont here and for Southern Vermont in some ways is that it isn't just going to the suburbs, or it isn't just going out into the hinterlands of your city. It's making
going out into the actual hinterlands.
The actual hinterlands, making a real change, a real shift, and that it's not that far. When people come to the stay-to-stay weekends for us in Brattleboro and Bennington, we're Manchester, where it's people that are living in the area. They took the time to make the trip, and there is a willingness to listen. People obviously are interested. That's why they're there, and that does seem. It's in conversations with people from some of those urban areas. It is remarkable how across the board it's getting too expensive to live there, or it is now impossible to get your foot in the door, even if you're trying to save up for 3% for a down payment, because that little condo is actually valued at $380,000, and this is silly. And it's nice to be able to show them in those that's something that we can help with, because that's something where throughout Southern Vermont there's opportunities to sort of things seem a little more attainable in that way, and that doesn't. That issue doesn't necessarily appeal. I think Natalie made a good point in your observation about in the op-ed that we have 1980 to 1996 or something like that is how Pew is sort of defined.
You're looking at demographics within demographics.
Yeah, and it's a very in some ways I see the pitch for young families to sort of maybe come a little bit more naturally than
very much so, I would say. And the problem with something like stay-to-stay, or even the problem of an expensive a city, is if you're young and you're a recent graduate and you're moving around, you're thinking the next 5 years seems a long time out. So, to move to Vermont for a year or two might be kind of fun, but it might be for a single person right out of college almost as expensive as moving to New York City, but without the fun of New York City. Yeah. So there is a sense of loss there, and I think that it can appeal to a certain type of person, and I think particularly for, if you're an upstart go-getter sort of type, you have fewer people competing for your job, and especially if you're college educated and you have the fortune to be going after positions like that, there's really a lot of opportunity. But it's again, if you're looking for an apartment, or the house is going to be a little bit beyond your grasp, and it's also beyond what you actually need, and yet there might not be something in that tier below, and whether or not you've had the flexibility to visit before, to go to stay weekend, that's a time and money investment. It's just a different group to work with, I think.
Something that's been on my mind with that has to do with student loans, and this is an area, Vermont as a whole, Southern Vermont, where there's a lot of 501c3 activities, there's a lot of public sector employment, and something that's occurred to me there where the public service loan forgiveness program is this it can be a very powerful motivator in some ways that's sort of dictating what kind of jobs people take, or maybe they have a position they want to be in, a public sector job to qualify for it. And something that's occurred to me is getting a real fluency with the ins and outs of that program may behoove a lot of our HR people or hiring people from some of those 501c3s in those municipalities, or those public sector positions to really have the pitch include something like that, and to know the ins and outs of it, and to help someone maybe just put that on someone's radar if it's not already on their mind, where it's knowing how to knowing sort of the ins and outs of the program is a way to speak to people that for whom that's maybe a bigger issue. It's been interesting to see some of our employers that are thinking about that very thing, about maybe people are more interested in student loan assistance than in a 401k contribution at this age, and that's something that's been I've been very heartened to hear that in some of my conversations with businesses in Bennington County, that there is that some HR departments are really thinking broadly about, well, we need people with those skills that comes from those college backgrounds, that comes with that college price tag, and so this is a sort of just really responding to what they're hearing from some of the interns that they have, from some of the newer hires, and that the idea of a benefits package can actually shift to really speak to the crop, the talent crop that you're looking to draw from. But it does seem that if the private sector is able to do that, it would behoove our public sector to have all of its ducks in a row to make the best sort of pitch that it can.
And you're hitting on something really interesting there, because if you're talking to your interns and you're talking to your new hires, there's a really big missing link, it seems to me, because there are a lot of schools in Vermont and there are a lot of students who will come, perhaps even from a city, to go to school in Vermont and might not think that they want to stay. But at the same time, even just talking to people about their post-grad plans and having those connections be a little more, if you have a robust young professionals group in your area that you're also going to school in and there's a relationship there, you can kind of envision who you would, not who you'd become, but what you could become if you stayed there after school. And if the community is responsive to what those people want, that's a retention mechanism right there.
What do you all make of the whole quality of life marketing tool that Vermont has attempted to use for a very long time now? We're going back decades here with this one, but the whole vision of skiing, hiking, kayaking, biking, all these outdoor activities you can do. Plus, it's like just a kind of a cool place to live. I mean, is that still sort of a compelling argument, do you think, that the state should be using, or is it one that any state could make an argument that said, hey, if you come here, if you come to Montana, you can go biking and hiking and kayaking too? I mean, does that still have some resonance, do you think?
Well, what's so funny is that I think it might actually be Nebraska. It just has something that they just came out with similar to those lines, where it's like, Nebraska, there's nothing to do here, and that phrase is, and it's put on a billboard, and it's with somebody like, whitewater rafting or something. Do they have whitewater rafting in Nebraska? I don't know. I should probably check that tourism website.
Somewhere where they go.
But it's something like that, where it's and so it pitches what your expectation is of the state against what people who live there would say that reality is, and I think that there is something to be had if you're an outdoorsy person or you like the freedom of space. I find living where I live in Dorset to be a little bit more relaxing than to be navigating suburban traffic in southeastern Michigan, but that's me. And I think that a big part of work-life balance and a big part of quality of life is also community. And I think that if we don't focus enough on retention, once you do get people in the door there, to be coming just for the job and to be staying just for the job and to not have the resources you would have in a city or a bigger area, or to even, if you want those things to have to be the one to start them, that can be exhausting, and that can feel a little, you're not just going to figure out what to go to by driving past, a busy bar or something like that. And so I think that the nature side of quality of life is very much true. I think the community side could use a little bit more shoring up.
That's an interesting point. I mean, it's something that strikes me, and this is sort of a speculation, that, one thing that's interesting about having a national forest and not a national park is that there's national parks are really made for people to use them, and they're very user-friendly. And, in our neck of the woods, there's, sort of the heritage really is about, there's little spots to do things. There's not some grand wayfinding plan in place. And the equipment needs to be yours, you gotta, and so there's a lot of, I know that Sarah, some of the stuff that you talked about with Vorek, there'd been some interesting, like the state parks, I think, had something in place where you could sort of borrow equipment and use it, and that seems, as we think more about people who are accustomed to things like ride shares, people who are accustomed to things like bike shares, I mean, it's like more and more people who are younger are not owning the things, they're using the equipment, and it strikes me as that represents an interesting separation between when I think here in Vermont, where people have a mudroom with the snowshoes, with the kayak, with the stuff, and there's the Nordic ski sails that sort of go on, and there may be a bit of a barrier for people who are new to the area. It's like, okay, now it's time to go do stuff, but before you go, we got to get you kitted out, and that's that can be a bit of a lifestyle change, and it'd be interesting to think about people interested in that sort of borrowing equipment as opposed to simply having to own it, but it does seem like the outdoorsy stuff here does require a little bit of stuff that goes along with it.
They're expensive hobbies. I also think quality of life is more than just sports and being outdoors, right? So like Vermont really does have this reputation as a wonderful outdoor recreational place. We do that well and that's wonderful, but I think there's more to it than that. So like part of quality of life is quality housing and affordable housing. It's also childcare. It's the ability to find work that you enjoy with people that you enjoy. It's being able to have things to do and being able to get places, right? So all of those add up to your quality of life. And I think, I mean, I have an arts background. I'm not a sports person. Let's just go there. And like, I do ride a bike, right? And I love my bicycle. And so like, I like that sort of outdoor recreation. I like that when it's warm out, I can go outside and go hiking and do all of these things, and that there are things to do, really. But I think we spend so much time and energy talking about hiking and biking and being outdoors. And like you were saying earlier, it should be a multi-pronged approach. So if we're talking about quality of life in Vermont, we should also talk about all of the other things that make it great. And if those things aren't making it great, what can we do to make it better? You know, so like I mentioned childcare. That's a thing that comes up a lot, especially for young families, especially for families that are not like the traditional nuclear families, like either single parents or like a lot of times for women that want to work, and the burden of childcare tends to fall on them, and not always, but traditionally, and that sort of thing makes it harder for demographics that are not in the majority to have a high quality of life in rural areas. You know,
it does seem, to return to your point, that quality of life isn't. It seems like it's not just the great outdoors, because everyone has an outdoors, but that, you know, the kind of community components you're talking about, that sort of fullness of life, where it's not just work and recreation. It's, you know, there's employment, there's recreation, but then there's time spent in, you know, where other people know your business, and that's, you know, and that's not always the best thing, but it's the sort of thing where there's a lot of paths crossing throughout the day, and, you know, it's funny, you see the same cars, the same license plates. It's like, you know, there's that person who lives around here who has a license plate that just says "con."
You may know people even if you don't know them.
And it's really, it's like, oh, that's who that is. I mean, those things I think do end up sort of filling in the gaps. And certainly I think something that Sarah and I have talked about has to do with that civic life, opportunities and openings to participate in that respect. But, you know, Natalie, do you still live up in the North Shire, or and, you know, and I guess towns of about 4,000, 2,000, et cetera, I'd be curious to hear, have you felt that there's on-ramps that you can see for getting engaged in things, or is
it's very tricky, and I think that the libraries have been actually the most responsive vehicles, and I think that that's wonderful, because it's one thing to say, you know, bring on the young people, and another to actually engage them once they're there, and through something like a library, all of a sudden you have a community incubator that's public. It's not just you trying to get together with friends. You know, you can come there if you're new to town and want a place to hang out and sort of see your sights, and a place where if you really are looking for a community, you might be able to build one. But so far, there's also, especially in Dorset and Manchester, there's very much kind of an old guard in there. And there's a sense sometimes as a young person where you're a young person and they're like, but where are the young people? And sort of looking all around you. And I found that very hard initially, because you're so much younger than everybody else. And I mean, my goodness, I'm white, so that to some extent it's kind of like it could be much harder than what it was. But you know, it's still, you're noticeable immediately. You're looked down upon to some extent. You know, it's like, oh, our new intern, and it's like, not your intern. Or I got there's not a lot of young men here for you a lot, which was like, thank you.
Like I'm looking for my sugar daddy.
I'm looking for my maple grandpas.
Right.
So there you go. But so I think that, you know, it's, and to some extent, how do you change? You can't micromanage people's attitudes. So there is that.
Well, I think that we sort of outwardly we are a very welcoming state. And, you know, specific to Southern Vermont, I think we sort of tout this like welcoming vibe. But I think we can say that as much as we want, but then we also have to practice it. And I think people sometimes don't see the difference. It's like, oh, but we were welcoming. It's like, yeah, but like, did you ask that person out to coffee, or did you invite them to like go to the library or come to, one of the select board meetings. I think you can say that you're going to do all these things to be welcoming, but then what does that actually mean? And I think there's a little bit of a disconnect as far as oh yeah, we're really welcoming.
There is a really interesting discussion that happened on Manchester, one of the Manchester marketplace groups a while ago about the all welcome here signs in businesses. And I think the problem that people saw with that was it's a very passive way to be welcoming,
right.
to be all welcoming and have your literally rainbow people, holding hands and walking dogs and patting small children on the head, in the pictures. And it's kind of but what does that mean? And is welcoming putting up a sign, or is welcoming being able to walk down the street and not feel stared at, and so there's just, and it's not a terrible thing to hang a sign is also
Sure.
the counter to that, where it's what's the harm in doing it?
Yeah.
So those become really interesting discussions.
That's a good point. I mean, yeah, the idea that we'll resolve it with a brand is really not enough. I mean, and there is, I think that what we're seeing is some of the challenges we may sort of expect in a place that's been losing younger people and sort of seeking to bring them in, that a lot of that recruitment or attraction or trying to bring people to the area, there is a little bit of a, there's, things can seem a little bit, oh, that's quaint, and quaintness comes with a double-edged sword of old-fashioned, of comments on your personal life for no obvious reason. And I think that there's something there that is a bit of a, I think there's some work to do in having an attitude or that of not simply stating a value, of having a sign, but also of not getting in our own way, and of sort of recognizing that that there's not a whole lot of sort of these can be surprising things to come across if you're not from a rural area. A lot of the sort of recruitment that I think we are embarking on that reaches people in urban areas more than reaches people in other rural areas. So this is actually a very important point of that for some people this might be their first experience in a rural area, and so there's if we can be as sort of mindful of this as possible, that can go a long way.
Yeah. I feel like a lot of the language that we use around the sort of retention and attraction of young people, it tends to be really marketing heavy.
Yeah.
And so I just have a personal philosophy of demonstration, right? So rather than marketing, I would prefer to demonstrate that I do the things that I say I do. And so in talking about being welcoming and trying to attract and retain young people, or any people for that matter, it's who are you trying to attract? When we're talking about quality of life, do we have a full and robust quality of life for the people that live here, for all of the people? And if it's not for all of the people, is that intentional or is it accidental? Right? And so being really thoughtful about who the people here are and who we want them to be. Right? And that can get really tricky very quickly because from the perspective of a young person, right? So I managed a young woman. She was fresh out of college. She was in AmeriCorps Vista. This was last year. And her and a group of other AmeriCorps Vistas went out to an event in town. It was a story night. And she came to me the next day and she was like, it was so strange. It was very sweet. This one was very nice. But this older woman came up to us and said, "You're young people. Why are you here?" Yeah. And was very excited to see them. But I was not there, but I can imagine that this woman's thought was that I want to welcome these people and get more people like them. But that is such an off-putting interaction. Like, hello, you are other. Why are you other? What brought you here? Let me point out why you're different. Instead of welcome, how'd you find out about this? Can I sit with you? I don't know, any of these things that's sort of following up on being welcoming. And so I think, I don't know, but maybe Vermont as a whole, a lot of the conversations I've had around the SEDS process has been, we're a very neighborly, very welcoming community. And I think people really believe that, but what they don't understand is that in their enthusiasm to be welcoming, sometimes they're doing the exact opposite of what they intend to. And so when we talk about things like Vermont quality of life and outdoor recreation, all of that, we're telling the same story about the same people and saying, you are welcome here because you're like us. And are we also actively trying to attract people who have different opinions and different values? And if so, how are we supporting them once they get here?
And what you talked about, when done right, is I think exactly where that power lies in a small town, neighborly, everybody knows your business, and therefore everybody can help you kind of way. And so, how that woman could have handled that, if it's like may I sit with you, what brought you here, let me hear more about you, that's exactly the valuable interactions I've had here, even just among, some of the librarians, that's exactly the right attitude is, you're a demographic we're really trying to reach, how can we support what you want to do? And by opening that up and listening to answers, we might have a small group and might only be 5 people, but it's still like that's something that feels genuine and supported and connected in a way that if it had a similar program, where I grew up in Sterling Heights, Michigan, to go to the library is like a thing that you do, and then you go to the grocery store, and then you do this, and then you do that. Whereas like here, that can really become a center point of your life. So if you do it right, it really goes a long way.
Yeah.
It's all fascinating. When you were mentioning,
Did you have questions for us? Yeah. Or just
No, I'm just sort of
We're just
enjoying
going.
listening to your, soaking it all up. When you mentioned earlier, Jonathan, about wanting to live in cities because nobody really knew who you were, I mean, did that ever resonate with me? My story is like when I graduated from UVM back in the distant mists of time, 1973, my first stop after UVM was New York City, because I wanted to go someplace where I really was anonymous.
The anti-cheers.
Yeah.
Nobody knows your name.
Exactly, and it was great. I loved it, and there were a lot of other fun things to do in New York too. But I find myself thinking a lot about this whole cost of living question too. I mean, it seems like it's hardly a day to go by I don't read a story about how people can't afford to live in San Francisco anymore unless you're working for Facebook or some tech giant and making $1 gazillion a year or whatever. Microsoft, I just read, is putting in a huge amount of money, $500 million, I think I read, into building affordable housing in Seattle, because people, again, if you're not at that upper 1 or 2% of being like a tech guru of some sort or another, you're kind of out of luck. And that prompts another question: okay, so where are all the people going to work in the grocery store and be, taxi cab drivers or whatever else? Where do they live? I guess I just wondered: do you think there really is going to come a point where it's so expensive to live in some of these cities? I mean, I think of the apartment I lived in Brooklyn 40 years ago, and what I paid then, $250 a month. I mean, I don't know how many zeros you need to add on to. It was not a great apartment.
More than one.
How many people were living there? Three, at least 2 zeros. Right?
Okay.
Or maybe. Yeah. Anyways.
I mean, sooner or later, you would think that people would say, "Hey, wait a minute. I don't need to be, working to pay my rent. I can move to Bennington or Brattleboro or Dorset and own a house for this."
You might need a couple zeros in Dorset too.
Probably so. Yeah. But I don't know. Is that a factor at all? Do you think among folks, or is it just that the attraction of cities is just so huge right now?
I think there's a yes and a no to it. Just because the cities are perhaps what you think of as your next conquering post-grad step, and I think that you're never going to totally change that population's mind, and people who want to do the starving artist thing and make it work and really struggle and write a memoir about it or whatever you do are going to give it a shot. But I think there are some ways that you could counter that in a very Vermont way, and I look at something like the inn in Manchester that they're trying to renovate into affordable housing, and the way that they're trying to scale that to be actually affordable in some ways instead of like Manchester affordable. And so it doesn't have to be that you counter cities by being like cities and saying, well, instead of moving to New York, have all the New Yorkers move over here. We'll put up high rises and be mini New York. You don't have to do that. And you can have these initiatives that seem to convert an old inn. Seems like very much a Vermont affordable housing fix. So I think that it could be a way to pull some of those folks in, but perhaps not right off the bat, or perhaps not all of them.
Right. I mean, it does seem like that there are smaller cities that are figuring out how to make the pitch to people in the larger population areas. So and it's so that's a a city like Buffalo, can be a.
Buffalo.
Me too.
See,
so
I've never heard
cute.
anybody say I don't like
Wonderful.
Buffalo. Everybody
It's a
likes
wonderful little
Buffalo.
city.
It is.
And Portland, Maine, Buffalo, they're these sort of
Cleveland.
out
Yeah.
Cleveland,
Cleveland rocks.
Sterling Heights, Michigan. There's all these places that have where they're sort of figuring out that they can make a pitch as for a cost-effective component. And I think that a lot of people will. That's very compelling because it doesn't necessarily involve the. It doesn't feel like as much of a disruption to career progress if someone's mindset is on, building from what the college years, grad school years, if that was a part of it or what have you. But there is a sweet spot, I think, where more people are willing to listen and think and talk about other options, and that's something where if we're able to make the case. I think two things need to happen. An individual maybe needs to think, for some people in law or medicine, there maybe is not a lot of wiggle room in terms of career components. Sometimes, for a long time, we've been able to make the case as a encore career, shifts in the late 40s, early 50s to that market, but we want to be able to make the case to people in that 20 to 30 bracket. In some instances, I think, as Natalie says, that's just not where folks are. But for people that are in that, transition of their own, careers to maybe young families, to thinking about things like school systems, things that just are not maybe on your mind when you're 22, there is, I think, will be a great deal of sort of receptivity. And it surprised me in some of the conversations that we've had through Stay to Stay. I had sort of thought that when people talked about what their taxes would look like, that we might see like, I don't know, but it was really, there's a lot of receptivity to the notion of like, yeah, there's things that come from that. There's benefits that accrue to you as a resident here because of that, and that was not. That's something that we hear a lot as like, it's too high. People aren't gonna, that's gonna really frustrate growth. And I'm not sure that necessarily bears out as people begin thinking of, what comes from that, or what does one have as a result of that. But it does seem that where there's a sort of flexibility on the part of HR professionals, and a flexibility on the part of prospective people coming to live here, residents, we can find something that fits, that feels good, and then some of that balance that we talked about earlier, that really can sort of help seal the deal when done correctly. But it is interesting to see smaller cities sort of being able to pull folks from the major centers and say, well, we can learn some things from that, and then we can also see, well, there's some people that the smaller cities didn't pull that we might be able to draw from, which is of interest to me.
I wonder about, and maybe Sarah and Jonathan, you know more about this, the sort of patterns of migration to cities and from cities. So a few years ago, I remember there being this sort of movement from the major cities to the smaller ones, right? So like at that point, Austin was still a small city, and now it's not, right? So like everyone up and moved to these sort of up and coming cities until they were no longer up and coming, now they just are. And so are we just in another wave of moving to other smaller cities again? And do they get smaller with each transition, or is it that because people have moved from other places, those places have shrunk, and now we just keep doing this sort of cycle?
That's a good question. We're certainly, nobody's moving to rural areas. We know that.
Right.
It does seem like the smaller outliers, what would have been an exurb, people are more comfortable making those drives into DC or, into North Jersey or something like that. But when I think of where, our largest population center here, I guess, would be Albany, about 1 million people, right? And I think that, it is interesting, once you get past the carrying capacity, like a couple 100,000 people, it does seem to, you're pulling from a 50-mile, 60-mile radius frequently. And so, I'd be curious to know, though, if that next sort of wave for smaller cities is going to continue to pull from larger ones or what. I'm curious.
It's all kind of fascinating because back in the 70s, of course, the back to the land thing was kind of the big prevailing norm, and going up to the country was kind of the cool thing to do, and living in cities was like,
Vermont had a successful young
beckoning state or whatever at one point, but it's just interesting how that shifts over time, and be curious to see if that shifts again at some point. We have about 5 minutes or so left, and before we all depart, I guess I just wanted to kind of once again go around the table and ask each of you, if you were the governor or somebody in charge or the dictator or whatever, and you could say, we shall be doing this. What would the one or two things be you would say, here's my edict for how we're going to attract more younger folks to the state? Is there one or two sort of magical silver bullets that you could think you could fire and say, hey, this is how we're going to fix the problem? Is there something along those lines that that pops immediately to mind that said, if only they could do this? I mean, the idea of the help on college loan debt it seems like a very creative one, and certainly things like Childcare and the Family Leave Bill will be very interesting to see where that goes. Because all those things play into it. Education is obviously another big thing, particularly younger families starting out. Is my child going to get the education that they need, to succeed later on in life? And that, of course, is another whole big question. We could spend probably another hour talking about that. Yes. But any thoughts come to mind as to what would be doable things that the state could do?
Oh. Wait, doable?
Yeah, right, that's different. I don't know.
Wait a second.
Or maybe fantasy things, whatever.
I mean, I can't necessarily think of a specific project or initiative, but I would say doubling down on education and transportation, and somehow pumping resources into those, because I feel like they have the potential to have large impacts. Slowly, though, right? So education takes forever. In transportation, you'd have to have some really creative solutions, and I don't know what those are. But I feel like with the sort of remote work, gig economy thing happening more and more, that would serve us in the future.
I think two things came to mind. One of them is, our family medical leave is not, I think, where it needs to be. We have lots of examples overseas of countries whose economies are able to support things like a year for parents. And I don't know what the right number is. Something that did come to mind when I was reading the proposal for the two states laid out by Governor Scott and Sununu was that it's an insurance element. And we insure against risks. And that's not how we should be viewing babies. I mean, these are very much investments. And I think that's some of the details. 60% of your wage for 6 weeks leaves you pretty behind, but that's part of that's an insurance-based approach. And in some ways, a market-based approach is just going to leave us with something like that, where it's better than nothing. And I think that that doesn't really provide the sort of that's an example of maybe not going as far as we could go to make a real distinction between this state and other states, where it's, for some people that can seem like a hand in the economy that we'll have to think through what challenges this lays out for employers, and make the right choice there. But it does seem like that I would like to move away from something like a risk-based approach. The second thing I think has to do a lot with housing. I do see housing as being a landlord is a difficult job. It's not easy. It's not cheap. But it's taken as industry, it's almost completely unregulated. There's no standards that you have to meet to be a landlord in the same way that you may need to if you had a manufacturing facility. There's not the same oversights. And I don't know if oversight is the answer to everything, but it does strike me as another situation where sometimes the right move from a market perspective is to not fix up the thing, is to let it go until it's completely lost its value. And sometimes that can mean that structures or equipment fixtures in structures reach a point of disrepair and almost a total loss. And that's one of the things where when people come to the area and they want to find a place to live, it might be something of real value to be able to say that, those sorts of nightmares don't happen here because that's not something that's allowed. Now, so I'm thinking more czar than just governor. But I do think those two things together really speaks to people from that 20 up to 40. I mean, 45. I mean, that's about a very broad range of I think that would appeal to.
If I were the governor, czar, dictator, two things that I think would be helpful and interesting to see. I would like kind of almost an onboarding process, like the insider's guide for the outsiders.
Cool.
It's things like Front Porch Forum or some of the more local specific Facebook groups, I think would be really helpful to, if you go to some of the town websites and you click on their housing, I know Bennington's like that, and you click on housing, it brings you to Zillow, and you're like, not what I'm looking for, Bennington, but just to know about those neighborhood resources and know that it is a more boots on the ground, and if you take a chance on maybe what's not your ideal apartment, but you get here, you're going to see, for sale signs, you're going to meet people, that just helping to navigate into that small town community before you actually do make that choice to jump there, and know that you're going to be okay and know that there are resources for you. And to be a little bit more familiarized with that before you get there would be very helpful. The other thing too, just from a storytelling perspective, I think that if seeing, if you're a skier, you're going to love more skiing here, and to try to find those people that are perhaps more different and have different stories to tell, and listening to those complaints. I would like to see more conversations like this with young people, and I'd like to see more conversations with people of color that have communities and families, and if those are types of people that you want to attract, then you have to elevate those stories from the get-go, and you have to acknowledge those complaints, and you have to own the fact that it's not, a perfect situation to be coming into, but in order to not be the why are you here person at the party, you have to listen to them and then ask, what do we do to help you? And without that sort of protecting yourself and taking a hands-off approach. So that's my dictator side.
Sure. You get the last word.
All right. I love all of those. I think if I could do more than one or two things, all of these things are great and necessary. I would probably take a stance from the employer side. I think, so I coordinate the Southern Vermont Young Professionals, and so I'm constantly interacting with young professionals who are moving or have recently moved or are leaving, and I've started this pet project, which is just a short survey, because I think we ask a lot of people, why are you here? Why did you come here? But we don't ask enough, why are you leaving? And what are those reasons? And how can we make those better? It's very person by person. Anytime I hear that someone's leaving, I'm like, hey, can you take this survey and just let us know what we can do better? Almost like a feedback form,
That's outstanding.
Yeah,
thank you.
Awesome.
Exit survey.
I was going to steal that idea.
Well, you're welcome to have it, yeah.
Implement.
should be used widely.
But one of the things that I hear the most is that it's sort of a twofold problem. The workplace that this young professional is working is not the culture is not necessarily sustainable, or the schedule is not necessarily sustainable. So that's definitely mostly on the employer side of things. It's like working with employers to make these workplaces and these jobs something that is sustainable. And I think it's difficult, because if you quit or you are fired from a job, it's not like we have 10 tech firms that you can then go and apply. It's sort of like there are only a few employers in each sector, and so most likely if you are out of a job, you're not going to the one down the street, you're going elsewhere. And that's some of the feedback I've heard is just this, well, there wasn't any place else for me to go, and I couldn't stay sane at my current position, so I'm leaving the area. And so that I think the employers really have to get on board with making their workplace sustainable. I think we have a ton of great companies, employers in Southern Vermont, but there's always work to be done.
All right.
Yeah.
Well, I guess we're going to have to leave it there. Really want to thank you all for taking the time to share some of these thoughts with us today. Really fascinating subject, and one I'm sure we're going to be having opportunities to talk about again
Great.
for a while. Anyway, I hope you've enjoyed the show. I want to thank you all for joining us, and also to thank Sarah Lang, Michelle Morocco, Natalie Redmond, Jonathan Cooper. Thank you for all being here.
Thank you.
And thank you for being with us again. Have a great day, and we'll see you the next time.